In this section, we're going to begin our exploration of sexual reproduction. And with sexual reproduction, we'll have to have meiosis. So there's a couple questions that we first have to ask ourselves. And the first main question is, well, why do we need sexual reproduction? So when we think about sexual reproduction, let's first give a definition to this word. Sexual reproduction is where you have two sources of DNA or genetic material. And so when we have these two sources of DNA, what that actually gives us or provides us with is genetic variability or differences in our offspring. So there would be no point in having two different sources of DNA if we needed offspring that were identical. But here we do need offspring that are genetically variable or have differences, and so that's why we need those two different sources. Some advantages, and actually goes right along with our definition, an advantage of sexual reproduction is that we get genetic variability or differences. What's the point of genetic differences? Well, the genetic differences leads way to biodiversity. And biodiversity is going to allow for certain species to survive better in their environment. So why would biodiversity or differences among one species like humans, why would differences in humans allow us to survive better? Well, biodiversity is going to be directly related to the idea of natural selection. And when we talk about natural selection, in nature, you should keep in mind that there's always changes, delta changes in the environment. So the changes in the environment are going to select for or cause for certain individuals in the species to survive better. So biodiversity differences in the species is ultimately going to help the species survive and to continue. There are some disadvantages, however, in sexual reproduction. And one of the disadvantages is going to be the need for a partner. Needing a partner is usually going to require more time and energy investment. And if you imagine a peacock has to have very pretty feathers in order to attract the female. And so there's a lot of energy spent in that, and there's also usually some form of courtship, so a lot of time as well. Another disadvantage is although you get these differences, like in the brothers that we see here, or the colors of the shells that we see in this picture above, you do sometimes get undesired characteristics. For example, if there's a recessive disease, this could be a way that the recessive disease pops up in the population. And which, kind of interestingly, needing unique cells could also be a disadvantage because of the energy investment required there. So when we're talking about these cells that we need, or the differences, the variability that we need, this is where we move into meiosis. So in meiosis, we actually have to combine DNA and we must reduce DNA. So, when we talk about reducing the DNA, or this reduction, we're talking about the number of chromosomes, or the chromosome number. Okay? So, what does all of that mean? In general, you should be able to remember that humans have 46 chromosomes. So we have to reduce that chromosome number. When we reduce, we're going to give ourselves 23 chromosomes in each of our sex cells to eventually produce the 46 that we need. We do not want, if there was no reduction, we would have 46 chromosomes plus 46 chromosomes, which gives us 92 chromosomes, which is not what we want. Okay, so we're thinking about these numbers of chromosomes. And when you think about the numbers of chromosomes, you have to think about diploid and haploid. But before we talk about diploid and haploid, let's just think about this number of chromosomes we're reducing. When we reduce the chromosome number, what type of cell are we putting these into? This is going to be in our gametes. Our gametes are also known as sex cells. And sex cells will come from what are known as germ line cells. Kind of the same idea as a stem cell, but germline cells are going to be specific in making our sex cells. From our germline cells, they will divide 2 times to create 4 haploid cells that are genetically different. So when we look at this word haploid, what does that mean? Haploid, you should think of the word half, is when your homologous chromosomes separate. So each parent donates half. Okay. So let's look at this. So let's look at this picture on the right-hand side. In this picture, they're showing you the process or the cycle for sexual reproduction. First, you have 2 adults. These adults have a chromosome number known as diploid. Okay? The prefix di actually means 2. And so you can almost imagine that when you see the word diploid, you actually have 1, 2 chromosomes that make up a pair. We know that we have 46 chromosomes, and that means we have 23 pairs. So the diploid number means that we have each one of the pair. So the 2n number is going to be your total number of chromosomes. So when you're an adult, your cells are going to have the total number. Your germ-line cells are going to divide. The process in which they divide is called meiosis. And they actually divide 2 times, as we said over here. When they divide 2 times, we will actually reduce the chromosome number, and we'll talk about specifically how this happens next time, and we'll produce a haploid numbered cell. Haploid literally is going to make you think half of the chromosome number. So in humans, our diploid number was 46. 46 in the male and the female. In the sperm, we'll have 23. In the egg, we'll have 23. This will be different for different species. Then in fertilization, you have your zygote, and this was sperm and egg joining together, so 23 plus 23. We now have a diploid 46 number of chromosomes. This single zygote with a total number of chromosomes will then go through mitosis and to produce our final offspring. Our offspring, in order to grow and develop, will go through more mitosis, more additional mitosis. And while it's growing, it will also form some somatic cells, which are also known as our body cells. Heart cells, skin cells, liver cells. So sexual reproduction requires alternation of generations. This term refers to our ploid numbers. So hap or diploid. Okay? And so this really just means that some cells will be haploid or diploid during its life cycle. Okay, take a minute to look back over this picture and to look at the terms, these new terms, or terms that you've probably seen it before, diploid and haploid, and how does that work, and why does that work. Also, review a little bit this idea of reduction or reducing the chromosome numbers. While you're reviewing that picture, you should also go ahead and take some time and define these vocabulary words for yourself. We can talk about any that are unclear to you. You might want to take a few minutes and use your book to define these as well before you move on to the next part of the notes. So, when we're looking at the notes, another idea that we have to consider is what type of organisms use sexual reproduction. So, what type of organisms? This is going to occur mainly in plants and animals, and in some fungi and protists, but mainly in plants and animals. When you're thinking about sexual reproduction and the organisms that use this, we always want to think about the advantages. And the advantage of sexual reproduction is related to finding a mate. For any sexually reproducing organism, finding a mate takes up or consumes most of its life. Some animals live only long enough to find a mate and to try to reproduce sexually. So, whether or not this is advantageous is related to what is required of the animal or of the organism. We do have a special example, though, of an organism that can reproduce through a process called parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis in reptiles allows them to use an unfertilized egg and create an offspring from the egg. This offspring, however, is actually going to be different from the parent. They think what happens is that in your unfertilized egg, the egg has an N number, right? That's the haploid number. So we'll actually take information or DNA from 2 of these haploid eggs to produce a 2N organism that is going to be genetically different from the parent. What we're going to see later on is that in a fungus, and this isn't a fungus, in a fungi, some schmooze, you can actually see in other organisms where they have this haploid and diploid chromosome number. And different processes have to occur. Meiosis and mitosis have to continually occur, just like with animals, for sexual reproduction to be productive. The last thing that we want to look at is how is meiosis similar to mitosis. So, with meiosis, we have a couple of things. In meiosis, you're going to produce a haploid cell. The haploid cell is going to be different or provide us with some variety. In mitosis, we're going to make a diploid cell. And the diploid cell is going to be identical to the parent cell. How are these two cells similar? When we think about how are these cells similar, they're still going through cell division. They're still using part of the cell cycle. we still need to prepare by replicating DNA. We're still going to use some checkpoints to regulate, and we'll still use spindles to divide the nucleus. And how are these different? When you think about the differences here, you want to think about, well, what's the purpose? What am I making in the very end? And another key difference is that in meiosis, division occurs 2 times, and you make haploid cells. Okay. Take a minute to review before you finish up your note card.